identifying them.
You were told to move. Hands up and turn
I
around.
haven't done anything wrong. This isn't necessary.
Do it now or you will be detained.
The morning sun streamed through the finger-painted windows of Sunshine Kids Learning Center, casting rainbow shadows across the tiny chairs and alphabet rugs. Tuesday, 9:47 a.m., the kind of Texas spring morning that promised warmth without the brutal summer heat, where the air still carried the sweetness of blooming jasmine from the garden outside. In the butterfly room, 12 toddlers sat in a wobbly circle, singing about wheels on buses while their teacher clapped along. Down the hall, infants napped in cribs beneath mobiles of smiling clouds. The smell of graham crackers and apple juice drifted from the snack station. Sunshine Kids occupied a cheerful, single-story building in Cedar Mills, a diverse suburban neighborhood 20 minutes outside Dallas. The center had served the community for 15 years, its waiting list perpetually full, its reputation built on warmth and genuine care. Bright murals covered every wall, giraffes stretching toward painted clouds, dolphins leaping through cotton candy waves, a rainbow arching over children of every shade holding hands. Parents lingered at drop-off, chatting with staff they'd known for years. This was the kind of place where teachers remembered every child's favorite snack, every parent's work schedule, every family's story. Security cameras watched it all. 8 of them positioned throughout the facility, capturing every corner, every entrance, every moment of the day. The system recorded continuously in high definition, storing footage for 60 days before overwriting. Standard procedure for any licensed childcare facility: protection against liability, documentation for concerned parents, evidence in case of accidents or disputes. What those cameras captured over the next 43 minutes would become the cornerstone of a federal lawsuit that would make national headlines. Would show the moment 3 men in tactical vests pushed through the front door without signing in. Would document the terror that unfolded in the butterfly room. Would preserve, in unflinching detail, 12 toddlers screaming for a teacher being dragged away in handcuffs. But at 9:47 a.m., none of that had happened yet. At 9:47 a.m., Sunshine Kids Learning Center was just a daycare on a Tuesday morning, full of finger paint and graham crackers, and children who believed the adults in their lives would always keep them safe. Monique Lawson had Texas running through her veins 3 generations deep. Her grandmother, Beulah Mae Lawson, had picked cotton in East Texas until her fingers bled, had marched for voting rights in Houston, had lived to see her granddaughter earn a college degree, and wept at the graduation ceremony. Her mother, Evelyn, had taught 3rd grade at the same elementary school for 31 years, shaping hundreds of young minds with patience and chalk dust and an unwavering belief that every child could learn. Monique had grown up surrounded by that legacy. Houston-born, Houston-raised. She'd played in the same parks her mother had played in, attended the same church her grandmother had helped build. She'd graduated from Westbury High School with honors, then earned her early childhood education degree from Prairie View A&M University, the same historically black university her grandfather had dreamed of attending but never could. She was 34 years old. She'd worked at Sunshine Kids Learning Center for 8 years, starting as an assistant teacher making $11 an hour, working her way up through dedication and genuine love for the work. Now she was lead toddler room teacher, responsible for the butterfly room and its 12 tiny humans. She had certifications in infant CPR, child development, early intervention techniques. She had a file full of glowing performance reviews and a wall of thank you cards from parents. The children adored her. They called her Miss Mo, reached for her when they were scared, showed her their drawings before anyone else. Parents requested her by name, some staying on the waiting list for months, specifically to get their child into her room. She knew every kid's quirks who needed extra time with transitions, who had allergies, who was struggling at home and needed gentler handling. Monique Lawson was, by every measure, an ordinary American living an ordinary life. She paid taxes. She voted in every election. She had an apartment in Cedar Mills, a car payment, a savings account for the house she hoped to buy someday. Her birth certificate sat in a fireproof safe at her mother's house in Houston, alongside her Social Security card, her passport, and 3 generations of family documents proving what should never have needed proving. She was the heartbeat of Sunshine Kids, and in 11 minutes, federal agents would stop that heart cold. Monique's Tuesday began like every other workday for the past 8 years. She pulled into the Sunshine Kids parking lot at 7:15 a.m., coffee in hand, her bag stuffed with laminated flashcards she'd made the night before. The morning was still cool, dew clinging to the grass around the playground equipment. She unlocked the side entrance with her staff key, disabled the alarm, and headed straight for the butterfly room. Preparation was everything with toddlers. She wiped down the tiny tables with disinfectant, arranged the chairs in a circle for morning meeting, set out the bins of crayons and blocks. She prepped the snack station, animal crackers and apple slices, small cups ready for juice. She queued up the morning songs on the classroom tablet, tested the volume, made sure the backup batteries were charged. By 7:45, the first parents started arriving. Drop-offs were always a mix of tearful goodbyes and eager runners. Monique greeted each child by name, complimented new shoes and fresh haircuts, assured anxious parents that yes, everything would be fine. Yes, she'd make sure Maya got her blanket at nap time. By 9:30, all 12 of her toddlers had arrived. The butterfly room hummed with controlled chaos, the natural state of any space containing a dozen 2-year-olds. They'd made it through circle time, stumbling through the days of the week song, arguing over who got to hold the weather bear. They'd survived a minor crisis when 2 boys wanted the same fire truck. Now they were in free play, the noise level hovering somewhere between cheerful and deafening. Monique knelt beside Sophia Reyes, a tiny girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, helping her with Velcro shoes that refused to cooperate. Sophia was chattering about her cat, something about whiskers and breakfast, the words tumbling out faster than her tongue could manage. "Almost got it, baby girl," Monique said, pressing the strap into place. "There, good as new." The front door buzzer sounded. Nothing unusual late drop-offs happened. Delivery drivers came by, parents forgot things. Through the butterfly room's interior window, Monique could see Denise at the reception desk, rising to answer. 3 men in tactical vests pushed through before Denise could reach the door. The letters on their chests were visible even from 40 feet away. ICE. Monique's hands froze on Sophia's shoe. They moved like men accustomed to resistance. Tactical formation, hands near belts, eyes scanning the space with practiced efficiency. 3 federal agents in a room designed for finger painting and nap time, their boots heavy on floors meant for tiny socked feet. Lead agent Victor Stanton was already talking before Monique could stand. "Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We need to speak with employees regarding work authorization." His voice carried across the butterfly room, flat and loud, cutting through the chatter of 12 toddlers who didn't yet understand what was happening. But they felt it. Children always feel it. The room went quiet in patches, some kids freezing mid-play, others looking up with wide eyes, a few continuing to babble, oblivious. Monique rose slowly, positioning herself between the agents and her children. She kept her voice calm, her movements deliberate. 15 years from now, body camera footage would show how steady she remained in this moment, how her hands didn't shake even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "You're in a classroom full of 2-year-olds, she said, her voice low but firm. "Whatever you need, we can discuss it outside." Stanton didn't move. "Ma'am, I need to see identification and proof of legal work status, now. I'm a U.S. citizen, born in Houston, Texas. I've worked here for 8 years. Monique kept her body angled toward the children, a human shield in a cardigan and sensible flats. "My documents are in my locker in the staff room. I'm asking you, please, step into the hallway. These are babies." Behind her, Sophia had started whimpering, her small hand reaching for Monique's leg. Another child, a boy named Deshaun, stood frozen by the block station, his lower lip trembling. The energy in the room was shifting, confusion curdling into fear, the way it does when children sense adults are scared. Agent Stanton's partners had spread out. One blocked the interior door, the other moved along the wall, his eyes cataloging faces, taking mental notes Monique couldn't read. "Ma'am, you need to come with us to verify your status. Step away from the children." I'm not leaving this room until someone qualified takes over care of these kids. Monique's voice didn't waver. Call my director. Call corporate. I'm not abandoning 12 toddlers with strangers. Stanton's jaw tightened. Behind Monique, Sophia began to cry. The agents didn't move toward the hallway. They spread wider instead. Agent Kowalski positioned himself at the interior door, his broad frame blocking the only exit to the rest of the building. Agent Brennan pulled out his phone and began photographing the room, the murals, the cubbies with children's names, the tiny faces staring up at him with growing confusion. The flash blinked again and again, clinical and cold. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again." Stanton's voice had hardened, patience evaporating like morning dew. "Produce documentation now or you'll be detained for failure to comply." "My purse is in my locker." Monique kept her voice steady, though her pulse was screaming. "Staff room, down the hall. My driver's license, my employee ID, everything is there." "Let me get it, or let me call Lorraine Okafor, our director. She has all my employment records, I-9 forms, background checks, everything went through proper channels when I was hired. We'll verify through our own channels. Step away from the children." "I'm not leaving them alone with..." "They won't be alone. Your coworkers can handle it." Stanton gestured vaguely toward the door, toward staff members who weren't there, toward a handoff that hadn't been arranged. "Move, now." Sophia's crying had grown louder, her small body pressed against Monique's leg, arms wrapped tight around her knee. The sound triggered a chain reaction. Toddlers are tuned to each other's distress like instruments in an orchestra of fear. One by one, the whimpering spread. A boy named Marcus started hiccuping, tears streaming down his round cheeks. A girl clutching a stuffed rabbit began wailing for her mama. Deshaun hadn't moved from the block station. He stood frozen, tears sliding silently down his face, watching the men in black vests with the kind of stillness that breaks hearts. Brennan's camera kept flashing. Kowalski stood like a statue at the door. The security camera in the corner recorded everything, the growing terror in 12 small faces, the agent photographing babies like evidence, the woman in the cardigan trying to hold the world together with nothing but her body and her voice. "Please." Monique heard the crack in her own voice, hated it. "Please. They're 2 years old. Whatever you think I've done, they haven't done anything. Step outside. 60 seconds. That's all I'm asking." Stanton reached for her arm. His grip was iron. Stanton's hand closed around Monique's wrist and yanked, pulling her away from the children with a force that nearly took her off her feet. She stumbled, caught herself, and then the cold metal was circling her wrists, the ratcheting click of handcuffs echoing through a room full of alphabet posters and crayon drawings. The butterfly room exploded. 12 voices erupted at once, screaming, sobbing, shrieking in a chorus of pure terror. "Miss Mo! Miss Mo!" The words tore from tiny throats, raw and desperate. Sophia collapsed onto the floor, her whole body shaking with sobs so violent she couldn't breathe. Marcus ran in circles, wailing. A little girl named Destiny started hyperventilating, her face going red, then purple. Deshaun broke free from his frozen state and sprinted toward Monique, his small arms outstretched, reaching for the only safety he knew. Agent Brennan stepped into his path, a wall of tactical vest and federal authority blocking a 2-year-old boy from his teacher. Deshaun bounced off the agent's legs and fell backward, landing hard on his bottom, his wail joining the others. "Stop! Stop this right now!" Lorraine Okafor burst through the door. Kowalski had been blocking, shoving past him with the force of a woman who'd spent 30 years protecting children. Her reading glasses hung crooked on her face, her cardigan buttoned wrong, clearly interrupted mid-task. "What are you doing? This is a licensed childcare facility. You can't..." "Ma'am, stand back or you'll be charged with obstruction." Kowalski's voice was bored, rehearsed. "Federal investigation." "Federal investigation of what? She's been with me for 8 years. I have all her documents." They weren't listening. They were already moving. Stanton and Brennan flanking Monique, guiding her through the chaos of screaming children toward the front of the building. Past the infant room where babies startled awake. Past Denise at reception, her hand pressed to her mouth in horror. Past the cheerful welcome sign and the parent bulletin board. Past the front windows, where 3 parents arriving for early pickup watched a black woman in handcuffs being escorted out of their children's daycare. The phones came out immediately. The footage would be online within the hour. The screaming didn't stop for hours. Lorraine Okafor moved through the butterfly room like a medic in a war zone, gathering children into her arms, calling for backup staff, trying to contain a catastrophe that had already detonated. But there was no containing it. Sophia had to be physically peeled off the floor where she'd collapsed, her small body rigid with terror, her voice gone hoarse from shrieking. Deshawn had retreated under a table and refused to come out, flinching every time an adult approached. Marcus vomited from crying so hard. 3 children couldn't catch their breath. Destiny's hyperventilation worsened until her lips turned blue. A boy named Jalen started gasping, his tiny chest heaving. A girl named Amara passed out cold on the reading rug. Lorraine called 911. While her assistant director loaded all 3 into her personal car, the ambulance would take too long. She decided in a split-second calculation that would later be scrutinized in depositions. All 3 children were treated for acute stress response at Cedar Mills Urgent Care. All 3 were under the age of 3. By 10:30 a.m., every parent on the Sunshine Kids contact list had received an emergency call. There's been an incident. We need you to pick up your child immediately. We'll explain when you arrive. The parking lot filled with panicked mothers and fathers, some still in work clothes, others in pajamas, all of them demanding answers that Lorraine didn't fully have. She told them what she knew. Federal agents. Monique detained. No charges explained. The children witnessed everything. Parents wept. Parents screamed. Parents held their traumatized toddlers and rocked them in the parking lot, afraid to take them inside, afraid to leave, afraid of a world where this could happen in a place designed to be safe. By 11 a.m., Lorraine had called corporate headquarters and secured a directive to preserve all security footage. By 11:15, she'd contacted a lawyer, a former parent, whose child had graduated to kindergarten 2 years prior, but who still sent holiday cards. By 11:30, the first parent video had been posted to Facebook. By noon, local news vans were parked outside Sunshine Kids Learning Center. Their cameras pointed at the cheerful rainbow mural like an accusation. The footage spread, the story caught fire, and somewhere in a federal holding facility, Monique Lawson had no idea the world was starting to watch. The cell was cold. That was what Monique would remember most clearly in the months that followed the relentless, bone-deep cold of concrete and metal and recycled air that seemed designed to remind you that comfort was a privilege you'd lost. They processed her in silence, photographed her, fingerprinted her, took her watch, her earrings, the hair tie from her wrist. Asked questions she answered over and over: name, date of birth, place of birth, citizenship status, until the words lost meaning, until Houston, Texas felt like a prayer she was begging them to believe. She asked for a phone call, request denied. She asked again at hour 2, hour 3, hour 4, denied, denied, denied. The agents cycled through shifts, new faces replacing old ones, none of them meeting her eyes, all of them treating her like a problem to be processed rather than a person to be helped. At hour 6, they finally let her call. Evelyn Lawson answered on the first ring. Baby, baby, where are you? It's all over the news. Mama, Monique's voice cracked for the first time since the handcuffs clicked. I need you to bring my documents. Birth certificate, social security card, passport. They're in the safe. I'm already in the car. Of course she was. Evelyn Lawson hadn't raised a fool, and she hadn't raised a victim. I'm coming, baby. I'm coming. The drive from Houston took 4 hours. Evelyn arrived at the facility by 8 p.m., documents in hand, fire in her eyes. She presented everything: original birth certificate from Houston Methodist Hospital, social security card issued 34 years ago, passport renewed last spring for a cruise that never happened. The verification should have taken minutes. It took 28 more hours. No explanation, no updates, no apologies. Monique sat in that cold cell while bureaucracy ground its slow gears, while paperwork sat on desks unexamined, while her mother waited in a plastic chair in a fluorescent lobby and refused to leave. Monique survived by reaching backward, by closing her eyes and hearing her grandmother's voice, rough with age and sweet with faith, singing the hymns that had carried Beulah May Lawson through cotton fields and courtrooms, and a life spent being told she didn't belong. "Precious Lord, take my hand," Monique whispered to the concrete walls. "Lead me on, let me stand." 42 hours after agents dragged her from a room full of screaming toddlers, Monique Lawson walked out of federal detention. Her mother caught her before she collapsed. Nadine Beaumont had spent 23 years making federal agencies regret their worst decisions. Her office in downtown Dallas was modest, no mahogany, no leather chairs, no intimidation tactics dressed up as decor. Just file cabinets stuffed with case histories, a wall of framed verdicts, and a reputation that preceded her into every courtroom. Immigration enforcement cases were her specialty. She'd seen it all: workplace raids, traffic stop detentions, families torn apart on suspicion and assumption. But when Monique Lawson walked into her office 2 weeks after her release, Nadine knew immediately this case was different. "They did it in front of the children," Monique said, her voice steady but her hands trembling around a cup of water she hadn't touched. 12 toddlers watched them drag me out in handcuffs. 3 of them ended up in urgent care. Nadine leaned forward. "Tell me everything." The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage from Sunshine Kids captured every angle: the agents pushing through the front door, the confrontation in the butterfly room, the handcuffing, the screaming children, the chaos left behind. 8 cameras, 43 minutes of uninterrupted documentation. Body camera footage, obtained through FOIA requests after months of bureaucratic stonewalling, confirmed what the Daycare cameras showed and added audio that made jurors flinch during depositions. 9 parents provided witness statements. 3 had been in the parking lot during the arrest, their phone videos already viral. 6 others documented their children's trauma in painful detail: the nightmares, the bedwetting, the terror at seeing anyone in uniform. Lorraine Okafor and 4 staff members gave testimony about the agents' refusal to follow any reasonable protocol, their dismissal of offers to verify employment, their treatment of a licensed childcare facility like a smuggling operation. Medical records told the rest. 3 children treated for acute stress response, 2 prescribed child-appropriate anxiety medication. 1 little girl, Sophia Reyes, had stopped speaking entirely for 11 days after the incident. The lawsuit filed in federal court alleged unlawful seizure, Fourth Amendment violations, racial profiling, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent infliction of emotional distress on minor children. 27 pages of constitutional violations committed against a woman whose only crime was being black in a daycare center in Texas. They made assumptions, Nadine told reporters outside the courthouse, and those assumptions traumatized a woman, devastated a community, and terrorized 12 innocent children. We intend to hold them accountable. Discovery broke the case wide open. Federal attorneys fought every request, filed motion after motion to seal documents, claimed national security concerns that collapsed under judicial scrutiny. Judge Patricia Thornton, a no-nonsense appointee with zero patience for obstruction, denied each attempt with increasingly pointed language. "The government does not get to hide misconduct behind classification stamps," she wrote in one ruling. "Transparency is not optional." What emerged from the unsealed documents was damning. Internal ICE communications showed that Stanton, Kowalski, and Brennan had been conducting a neighborhood sweep that morning, not based on specific intelligence, not responding to credible tips, but targeting Cedar Mills because demographic data suggested high probability of undocumented workers. No individual names, no specific locations, just assumptions drawn from census information about a diverse suburban community. Agent Stanton's text messages were worse. 3 days before the Sunshine Kids raid, he'd messaged a colleague, "Heading to Cedar Mills tomorrow. Easy targets. Should hit quota before lunch." Another text, sent the night before. "Daycares and restaurants. Low resistance. Quick processing." The casual cruelty of it sat in the courtroom like a stench no one could ignore. Depositions revealed contradictions, stacked on contradictions. Stanton claimed he'd received a tip about undocumented workers at Sunshine Kids. When pressed for documentation, none existed. Kowalski said they'd followed standard protocol. When confronted with the actual protocols, which required supervisor approval before entering childcare facilities, he went silent. Brennan couldn't explain why he'd photographed the children, couldn't justify blocking a 2-year-old boy from reaching his teacher, couldn't meet anyone's eyes when the security footage played on the courtroom screen. Expert witnesses drove the final nails. Child psychologists testified about the long-term damage of witnessing caregiver detention, disrupted attachment, chronic anxiety, developmental regression. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a specialist in early childhood trauma, presented research showing that experiences like what the butterfly room children endured could alter brain development, could echo through decades of life. These children learned that the adults who protect them can be taken away without warning. Dr. Vance said, her voice quiet but devastating. That is not a lesson any 2-year-old should learn. The defense had nothing left. The evidence had already spoken. The trial lasted 3 weeks. It felt like 3 years. Federal Courtroom 4B in Dallas became a theater of accountability. Every seat filled, overflow crowds watching via closed-circuit feed in adjacent rooms. Media from across the country had descended. This wasn't just a local story anymore. This was a referendum on enforcement, on assumptions, on what happens when power meets prejudice in a room full of toddlers. Monique took the stand on day 4. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, her grandmother's cross around her neck. Nadine guided her through the story gently, methodically, her Houston childhood, her family's legacy, her education, her career. The jury heard about Beulah May picking cotton with bleeding fingers, about Evelyn teaching 3rd grade for 31 years, about 3 generations of Texas women who'd built lives through work and faith and stubborn refusal to be erased. "Why do you work with toddlers?" Nadine asked. Monique's voice caught. "Because they're just starting to learn who they are. They're learning whether the world is safe, whether people can be trusted. I wanted to be someone who taught them yes. The world is safe. People can be trusted." She paused, wiping her eyes. Those agents taught them the opposite. In 43 minutes, they undid everything I'd spent years building. Parents testified next. One after another, they described children who'd been bright and curious before that Tuesday morning and were now shadows of themselves. Nightmares that persisted months later. Fear of strangers so intense that doctors' visits required sedation. Regression, children who'd been potty trained, suddenly wetting themselves again. Children who'd been speaking in sentences, retreating to single words. Sophia Reyes's mother sobbed on the stand. She didn't talk for 11 days. My baby girl, who never stopped chattering, went silent. And when she finally spoke again, the first thing she said was, "Where's Miss Mo? Did the bad men take her away forever?" Child psychologists presented clinical evidence. Lorraine Okafor testified about the devastation to Sunshine Kids, 4 staff members who quit immediately, too traumatized to return, 12 families who withdrew their children, a waiting list that evaporated overnight. A business built on trust, shattered by 3 men who couldn't be bothered to verify a birth certificate. On day 12, the security footage played. The courtroom fell silent as the jury watched. 8 camera angles, synchronized, showing every moment. The agents pushing through, the confrontation, the handcuffs clicking shut, and then the screaming. 12 tiny voices shrieking in terror, the sound quality crystal clear, impossible to ignore or minimize or explain away. Sophia collapsing, Deshawn being blocked by Agent Brennan. Children running in circles, crying for Miss Mo, their world ending in real time. Several jurors wiped their eyes. One asked for a recess. Agent Stanton, sitting at the defense table, stared at his hands and didn't look up for the rest of the day. 7 hours. That's how long the jury deliberated before requesting to return to the courtroom. Monique sat between her mother and Nadine, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Evelyn gripped her daughter's arm, her lips moving in silent prayer. Behind them, the gallery was packed. Parents from Sunshine Kids, advocates, reporters, strangers who'd followed the case and needed to see how it ended. Judge Thornton called the court to order. The foreperson, a middle-aged black woman in a burgundy blazer, stood with the verdict form trembling slightly in her hands. On the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, how does the jury find? We find the defendants liable. On the claim of racial discrimination in enforcement, we find the defendants liable. On the claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress, liable. On the claim of negligent infliction of emotional distress upon minor children, liable. Unanimous. Every count. The word liable echoed through the courtroom like a bell tolling justice. Judge Thornton turned to the damages phase. The foreperson continued reading, her voice growing stronger with each figure. Compensatory damages for Monique Lawson's unlawful detention, psychological trauma, lost wages, and ongoing treatment, $2,400,000. Evelyn's grip tightened on Monique's arm. Additional compensatory damages to be allocated to a therapeutic fund for the affected children of Sunshine Kids Learning Center, $1,200,000. Somewhere in the gallery, a parent let out a choked sob. Punitive damages against the defendants, intended to punish the egregious conduct and deter future violations of civil rights, $4,800,000. The foreperson looked up from the paper, her eyes finding Monique's across the courtroom. Total award, $8,400,000. The courtroom erupted. Applause, cheers, weeping a release of tension that had been building for months. Advocates embraced. Parents clutched each other. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Monique didn't move. She sat perfectly still as her mother collapsed against her shoulder, weeping with a grief and relief too tangled to separate. Nadine squeezed her hand once, firm and brief, professional to the end. At the defense table, Agent Victor Stanton stared at the floor. His face was gray, emptied of the arrogance that had carried him into a daycare full of toddlers 8 months ago. Kowalski sat rigid, jaw clenched. Brennan had his head in his hands. Monique finally allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about the record, permanent, public, undeniable that what they'd done was wrong. That 12 children's screams had been heard. That her grandmother's granddaughter had stood in a federal courtroom and refused to be erased. $8,400,000. The cost of assuming a black woman in a cardigan didn't belong in her own country. The consequences came swift and absolute. Agents Victor Stanton, Kowalski, and Brennan were terminated within 6 weeks of the verdict. Internal review boards that had dragged their feet for months suddenly found urgency, their reports echoing what the jury had already declared: gross misconduct, violation of protocols, conduct unbecoming of federal officers. Stanton appealed his termination. The appeal was denied. His text messages about easy targets and hitting quota had been read into the public record. No agency wanted that stain on their roster. Policy changes followed. The Department of Homeland Security issued new protocols requiring supervisor approval before any enforcement action at childcare facilities, schools, hospitals, or medical centers. Written documentation of probable cause became mandatory before detention. Verification of citizenship claims was required within 12 hours, not 42. The reforms weren't perfect. Advocates pointed out loopholes, enforcement gaps, the distance between written policy and lived practice, but they were something. They were acknowledgement that what happened in the butterfly room should never happen again. Monique didn't touch the settlement money for 3 months. It sat in an account while she focused on healing therapy twice a week, long walks with her mother, quiet evenings relearning how to feel safe in her own skin. The nightmares faded slowly. The flinch at unexpected sounds took longer. When she was ready, she knew exactly what to do. The Beulah May Lawson Scholarship Fund launched on what would have been her grandmother's 93rd birthday. Full tuition for early childhood education students from underrepresented communities, black and brown women who wanted to do what Monique had done, who wanted to shape young minds and build safe spaces, who deserved support instead of suspicion. The first class of recipients included 12 scholars, one for each child who'd been in the butterfly room that Tuesday morning. 8 months after her detention, Monique returned to Sunshine Kids. She'd considered other paths. Other centers had offered positions, higher pay, fresh starts, places where no one would look at her and remember. But Sunshine Kids was home. The butterfly room was hers. Running away felt like letting them win. Her first morning back, she arrived at 7:15, just like always. Unlocked the side entrance, disabled the alarm, walked to the butterfly room and stood in the doorway, breathing through the tightness in her chest. The room looked the same. Tiny chairs, alphabet rug, finger-painted windows catching the morning light. At 8:30, the children started arriving. New faces mixed with familiar ones. Some families had returned when they heard Miss Mo was coming back. And then, clutching her mother's hand in the doorway, there was Sophia Reyes, 3 years old now, pigtails, gap-toothed smile, eyes that went wide when she saw Monique standing by the Circle Time rug. "Miss Mo!" Sophia broke free from her mother and ran full speed, arms outstretched, crashing into Monique's legs with the force of a small hurricane. Monique knelt down and gathered her close, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her chest, the small arms wrapped tight around her neck. "I missed you," Sophia whispered. "I missed you too, baby girl." Monique's voice broke. "I missed you too." She became an advocate after that. Conference speeches about protecting vulnerable spaces, testimony before state legislatures considering childcare worker protections, interviews where she told her story again and again, not for sympathy, but for change. She spoke about the children who still flinched at loud noises, about the parents who still checked twice before leaving their kids anywhere, about the workers who deserve to do their jobs without fear of federal agents treating them like criminals. The trauma didn't disappear, but it transformed into something useful, something that mattered. 3 years later, Monique Lawson still walks through the doors of Sunshine Kids Learning Center every morning. Her title is different now: assistant director, responsible for staff training, parent relations, curriculum development. She still stops by the butterfly room every day, still knows every child's name, still keeps graham crackers in her desk for toddlers who need a little extra comfort. Some things don't change, some things shouldn't. The center installed a bronze plaque in the lobby last spring. It hangs beside the welcome sign, above the cubbies where parents store diaper bags and extra clothes. The words are simple: every child deserves to feel safe. Every worker deserves dignity. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, if you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes, your mood suffers, everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk, nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 30-Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program, no pills, no medication, that actually retrains your brain to sleep through the night, 7 to 8 hours, uninterrupted. It uses the same method sleep clinics charge thousands for. But instead of paying for expensive doctors, you get a clear, step-by-step plan you can follow from home. Over 30 days, it rewires your sleep system. And once you're done, you keep the results. There's a maintenance plan so you don't slip back. Look, if you've tried everything and nothing sticks, this is different. I'll leave a link in the description below.
I'm Judge Denise Albright. I've been on this bench for 18 years.
A judge? You? That's cute. It's always the same with you people. Where'd you get that badge? The flea market? eBay?
Call dispatch. Call anyone. They will confirm who
I'm not
I am.
calling anybody. You're going to tell me who you really are. We're going to have a...
At 6:47 p.m. in the underground parking garage of the Jefferson Federal Courthouse, a white police officer slammed a black woman face first onto the hood of her Mercedes. Her glasses flew off and skittered across the concrete. Her briefcase hit the ground, scattering legal documents beneath the wheels of nearby cars. The officer wrenched her arms behind her back and snapped handcuffs onto her wrists so tightly the metal bit into her skin. The woman was Judge Denise Albright, a sitting United States federal district judge with 18 years on the bench. The officer who put his hands on her was Sergeant Vincent Raleigh, a 16-year veteran assigned to courthouse security, who had decided in the span of 30 seconds that she didn't belong in the judge's reserved parking section. He never checked her credentials. He never read the nameplate on her parking spot. He saw a black woman near an expensive car and assumed she was a threat. What Raleigh didn't know was that 4 security cameras were recording every second from every angle. Within 72 hours, the FBI would open a civil rights investigation. A police chief would be forced to resign, and Raleigh would face federal charges that would end his career and send him to prison. All because of 11 minutes of footage he didn't know existed. Before we continue, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe because the next story is one you don't want to miss. Sergeant Vincent Raleigh was 44 years old and had been assigned to the courthouse security detail for 6 years. Among colleagues, he was known as strict, a label that in his case meant aggressive stops, invasive questioning, and a particular interest in anyone who didn't look like they belonged. His personnel file told a different story than his reputation suggested. Over 14 years, 31 formal complaints had been filed against him. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation. Black attorneys had reported being stopped in hallways and asked to prove they were lawyers. Black clerks had been questioned about why they were accessing certain floors. Black visitors had been detained for walking too confidently in spaces Raleigh decided weren't meant for them. None of the complaints ever resulted in discipline. Internal Affairs dismissed every single one as unsubstantiated, never once pulling security footage or interviewing witnesses who had offered to testify. Raleigh was protected. His brother-in-law sat on the city council. His union representatives made clear that pursuing him would create problems. Fellow officers who witnessed his behavior either laughed along or stayed silent out of fear. The system had taught Raleigh that he was untouchable, that his badge allowed him to decide who belonged and who didn't, and that no one would ever hold him accountable. On this evening, in that parking garage, he would finally encounter someone he couldn't intimidate into silence, someone whose word carried more weight than his badge ever could. Judge Denise Albright was 59 years old and had spent her entire life proving she belonged in rooms where people assumed she didn't. She grew up in public housing in Baltimore, the daughter of a bus driver and a hospital cleaner. She was the first in her family to attend college. She graduated from Harvard Law School in the top 10% of her class. She spent 12 years as a federal prosecutor, building a reputation for being meticulous, relentless, and impossible to intimidate. When a Republican president nominated her to the federal bench, she was confirmed 94-6. Senators on both sides called her fair, tough, and exactly what the judiciary needed. In 18 years on the bench, she had earned the respect of colleagues, attorneys, and clerks across ideological lines. Her personal life had demanded just as much strength. Her husband passed away when their daughters were young, and she raised them alone while managing a caseload that would have broken most people. Both daughters were now attorneys. That evening, she had stayed late in her chambers to finish an opinion in a civil rights case. The irony of that would become apparent soon enough. She left at 6:40 p.m., wearing a blazer and slacks, carrying her leather briefcase, her judicial ID badge clipped to her belt in plain view. She walked toward her assigned parking spot, the same spot she had used for 18 years, marked with a sign that read, "Reserved Judge Albright." She had no idea someone was watching her and deciding she didn't belong. The underground parking garage sat 3 levels beneath the Jefferson Federal Courthouse. The reserved section for judges and senior staff occupied the area closest to the elevator bank, well lit and monitored by security cameras mounted on every concrete pillar. At 6:42 p.m., Sergeant Vincent Raleigh sat in his patrol vehicle near the elevator, scrolling through his phone, handling personal business on department time. He wasn't watching the monitors. He wasn't conducting rounds. He glanced up when he heard footsteps echoing across the concrete. What he saw was a black woman walking toward a Mercedes in the judge's section. His mind filled in the rest. She didn't belong. Possible car thief. Maybe a cleaning lady who wandered into the wrong area and got ideas. What he chose to ignore told the real story. Her professional attire. The ID badge clearly visible on her belt. Her confident stride toward a specific vehicle. The walk of someone who had made this trip 1,000 times. The nameplate on the parking spot directly in front of her. Raleigh set his phone down and opened his door. He had already decided what was happening and who she was. He stepped out of his vehicle and moved to intercept her before she could reach her car door. Above him, 4 security cameras recorded every step, capturing angles he never thought to consider, preserving footage that would eventually cost him everything. Raleigh's voice echoed off the concrete walls before Judge Albright could reach her car door. "Stop right there. This area is restricted. What are you doing down here?" She turned to face him, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. "I'm parked here." "This is my vehicle." Raleigh stepped closer, one hand resting on his duty belt, his eyes scanning her with open suspicion. "I'm going to need to see some identification. This section is for judges only." Judge Albright glanced down at the judicial ID badge clipped to her belt, clearly visible, then looked back at him. She pointed to it. "I'm Judge Denise Albright. I've been parking here for almost 2 decades. Raleigh looked at the badge for half a second, then scoffed. "Anyone can buy a fake badge. I need real ID, driver's license, now." Her voice remained measured, controlled. "Officer, I'm telling you who I am. You can verify this with a single phone call to courthouse security." His expression hardened. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you're in a restricted area and you're being evasive. That's suspicious behavior." The accusation hung in the air. A federal judge with 18 years on the bench, standing 10 feet from a parking spot with her name on it, being told she was acting suspicious for existing in a space she had every right to occupy. Judge Albright took a slow breath, keeping her movements deliberate and visible. She began reaching toward her purse to retrieve her driver's license. Raleigh's hand shot up. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't reach for anything." She stopped, her hand frozen mid-motion. "Officer, you asked for identification. I'm complying with your request." "You're being combative," he snapped. "You're resisting." The contradiction was absurd. He had demanded ID, then prevented her from producing it. Near the elevator, a court clerk had just stepped out and stopped cold, watching the confrontation unfold. 50 feet away, a security guard stood frozen at his booth, unsure whether to intervene. Raleigh's voice rose. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle. Now, I'm not asking again." Judge Albright held his gaze, her voice steady but firm. "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake. I am asking you to verify my identity before this goes any further." Raleigh stepped into her space, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "I don't take orders from you." The security cameras kept recording, capturing every word, every movement, every second of what was about to happen next. Raleigh grabbed Judge Albright's arm and spun her around with enough force to knock her off balance. Before she could steady herself, he shoved her forward, slamming her face first onto the hood of her own Mercedes. The impact was brutal. Her cheek struck the metal with a dull thud. Her glasses flew off and skittered across the concrete, one lens cracking against a pillar. Her briefcase hit the ground and burst open, scattering legal documents beneath the surrounding cars. He wrenched her arms behind her back, twisting them at an angle that sent pain shooting through her shoulders. The handcuffs clicked shut too tight, the metal edges biting into the skin of her wrists. "You're hurting me," she said, her voice strained but controlled. "I am not resisting." "This is assault." Raleigh leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "You should have cooperated. People like you always make it difficult." The words hung in the air, captured perfectly by the security cameras still recording from 4 angles. Every frame showed the same undeniable truth: her compliance, his aggression, violence without justification. Near the elevator, the court clerk had her phone out, hands trembling as she recorded. The security guard was on his radio, calling for backup. And stepping out of the elevator, stopping dead in his tracks at the scene before him, was another judge. Senior Judge Franklin Holloway was 71 years old with 30 years on the federal bench. He had seen a lot in his career, but nothing prepared him for the sight of his colleague pinned to the hood of her car by a uniformed officer. He moved faster than a man his age should, closing the distance in seconds. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice boomed across the garage. "That's Judge Albright." Raleigh didn't release his grip. "Sir, step back. This doesn't concern you." Holloway's face flushed red with fury. I'm Senior Judge Franklin Holloway. Take those handcuffs off her immediately. She's been on this bench longer than you've been wearing that uniform." For the first time, Raleigh hesitated. His eyes flicked between Holloway and the woman still pressed against the car. The security guard arrived, slightly out of breath. "Sergeant, that's Judge Albright. Her parking spot is right there." He pointed at the sign less than 5 feet away. "Her name is on it." Raleigh's expression shifted. Not remorse, not shame, fear. The fear of a man who suddenly realized he had made a mistake he couldn't undo. He released his grip and stepped back, already formulating his defense. "She wasn't cooperating. She was being suspicious. I was following protocol." No one in that garage believed him, and the cameras had already recorded the truth. Raleigh reached for the handcuffs with reluctant hands, unlocking them slowly as if delaying the moment might somehow change what he had done. The metal fell away, revealing deep red marks already forming on Judge Albright's wrists, indentations where the cuffs had bitten into her skin. She did not yell, she did not cry. She stepped away from the hood of her car, rolled her shoulders once, and bent down to retrieve her glasses from the concrete. One lens was cracked straight through the middle. She picked up her scattered documents one by one, placing them back into her briefcase with steady hands. Then she straightened her blazer, brushed the dust from her sleeves, and turned to face Raleigh with an expression that carried more weight than any outburst ever could. "Badge number and name. Now." Her voice was calm, precise, and absolutely unwavering. Raleigh stammered out the information. Behind him, Judge Holloway was already on his phone, speaking rapidly to the chief judge of the district, then immediately calling the U.S. Marshals. He pointed at the security guard. "Get your supervisor down here now. I want every second of footage from this garage preserved. Nothing gets deleted. Nothing gets overwritten." Judge Albright's voice cut through the chaos. "I want this documented. Every frame. I want his entire personnel history pulled. And I want the FBI notified tonight." Raleigh stood frozen, suddenly surrounded by people who outranked everyone he had ever known, and every single one of them was furious. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened an investigation within 12 hours. The charges under consideration were severe: assault of a federal official, deprivation of rights under color of law. The security footage was the foundation of everything. 11 minutes of crystal-clear video from 4 separate angles, showing the entire encounter from the moment Raleigh exited his patrol car to the moment the handcuffs came off. There was no ambiguity. Judge Albright had been compliant, calm, and clearly identifiable throughout. Her ID badge was visible in every frame. Her parking spot, marked with her name, appeared in 2 of the camera angles. Raleigh had been aggressive from his first words, dismissive of her credentials, and violent without any justification. The audio was even more damning. Every word had been captured, including "people like you always make it difficult." Federal investigators marked it immediately as evidence of racial bias. The police department attempted damage control. The chief released a statement calling it a misunderstanding and citing proper protocol for suspicious persons. Federal investigators shut that down within hours. This was not a misunderstanding. This was assault, captured on camera, with clear evidence of discriminatory intent. The 31 previous complaints against Raleigh were reopened. For the first time, witnesses were actually interviewed. Patterns that had been ignored for years were finally documented. Investigators discovered that at least 19 other black professionals had been stopped, detained, or humiliated by Raleigh at the courthouse over 6 years. Not one of their complaints had ever been taken seriously, until now. The security footage became public 3 weeks after federal charges were confirmed. Media outlets obtained it legally through Freedom of Information Act requests, and within 48 hours, the video had reached 5 million views. The image of a federal judge pinned face down on the hood of her own car, a uniformed officer pressing her into the metal, became iconic overnight. National outrage followed. The legal community issued statements of condemnation. Civil rights organizations called for systemic reform. Judicial associations across the country demanded accountability not just for Raleigh, but for every supervisor who had enabled him. The "people like you" moment became the defining clip. Networks played it on loop. Commentators analyzed the tone, the words, the casual cruelty of a man who believed he was untouchable. It encapsulated everything wrong with racial profiling in a single sentence. Previous victims began coming forward. Black attorneys who had been stopped in courthouse hallways shared their stories publicly for the first time. Paralegals described being questioned about their right to access certain floors. Courthouse employees recounted years of humiliation they had learned to endure in silence. The patterns were undeniable. The police union initially defended Raleigh, calling his actions consistent with procedure for suspicious persons. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Within 72 hours, the union retracted its statement. Then came the revelation that destroyed the department's credibility entirely. Internal Affairs had never once pulled security footage when investigating complaints against Raleigh. Not once in 31 complaints over 14 years. The cover-up was systemic, and now it was exposed. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. Sergeant Vincent Raleigh was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242 and assault of a federal official under 18 U.S.C. Section 111. Additional charges followed as investigators documented the pattern of civil rights violations spanning 6 years. Conspiracy charges remained under consideration. The arrest happened at 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Federal agents arrived at Raleigh's home, cuffed him in his driveway, and walked him past the television cameras that had been tipped off just early enough to capture every moment. The uniform he had used as a weapon for 16 years was gone. He wore a gray sweatshirt and the expression of a man who still couldn't believe the system had turned against him. His brother-in-law, the city councilman who had helped shield him for years, released a statement within hours distancing himself completely. Political survival mattered more than family loyalty. The police chief resigned 3 days later after federal investigators revealed he had personally dismissed 3 complaints against Raleigh without any review. 2 internal affairs officers were suspended pending criminal referral for obstruction, accused of deliberately failing to investigate complaints they knew had merit. Raleigh's attorney issued a statement claiming his client was just doing his job and had followed standard protocol. The footage made that defense impossible. 11 minutes of video showing a compliant woman being brutalized for no reason other than the color of her skin. No procedure justified what those cameras captured. The federal trial lasted 4 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The jury watched the 1-minute security footage in full, multiple times, from all 4 angles. They saw Raleigh approach a calm, professional woman. They saw him dismiss her credentials. They saw him slam her onto the hood of her car. They heard "people like you" in crystal clear audio. Judge Albright took the stand and testified with quiet dignity. She described the humiliation of being thrown against her own vehicle in the building where she had served for 18 years. She described the pain that shot through her shoulders as her arms were wrenched behind her back. She described the violation of being treated as a criminal in her own workplace by a man who never once considered she might be telling the truth. 14 of the 19 identified victims testified after her. Black attorneys who had been stopped and interrogated, paralegals who had been accused of trespassing in their own offices, courthouse employees who had suffered in silence for years because no one in power would listen. Their stories filled the courtroom, one after another, establishing a pattern that could no longer be denied. Use of force experts testified that Raleigh's actions violated every standard of professional policing. The defense attempted to argue reasonable suspicion, but the footage destroyed every claim before it could take hold. Raleigh had refused a plea deal, insisting he had done nothing wrong, demanding his day in court. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing drew national media coverage. Every seat in the courtroom was filled. Reporters lined the hallway outside. Judge Albright delivered her impact statement with the same composure she had shown in that parking garage. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She spoke not for herself, but for every black professional who had ever been presumed not to belong, every person who had been stopped, questioned, and humiliated for existing in spaces they had earned the right to occupy. Other victims followed. 14 statements read into the record, stories of being traumatized and silenced for years, finally heard in a courtroom where their words carried legal weight. The presiding judge, a white woman with 25 years on the federal bench, delivered remarks that left no room for ambiguity. She condemned the systemic failures that had allowed Raleigh to operate unchecked. She condemned the culture of impunity that protected abusive officers. She condemned the institutional racism embedded in a department that had dismissed 31 complaints without once reviewing available evidence. The sentence was 5 years and 4 months in federal prison, one of the longest sentences for a police civil rights conviction in the district's history. Raleigh sat motionless as the words were read, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. He had never believed the system he served would actually hold him accountable. He was wrong. The message was clear. Badges are not shields against justice. The civil lawsuit followed the criminal conviction. Judge Albright filed against the city and the police department, and the case never reached trial. The evidence was too damning, the liability too clear. The settlement was $3.2 million plus sweeping institutional reforms that would reshape how the department operated for years to come. The mandated changes were extensive. An independent oversight board with full subpoena power, mandatory bias training for every officer with quarterly assessments, automatic footage review for all citizen complaints, eliminating the discretion that had allowed supervisors to bury inconvenient evidence, a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory enforcement, with termination as the mandatory consequence. A separate compensation fund of $750,000 was established for Raleigh's other victims, the 19 black professionals whose complaints had been dismissed, ignored, and filed away for years. It was an acknowledgement, long overdue, that the system had failed them. Judge Albright used a portion of her settlement to establish the Albright Justice Initiative, a foundation providing legal support for victims of police misconduct and funding body camera accountability programs across the country. She returned to the bench the week after the sentencing, taking her seat with the same diligence and precision she had always brought to her work. But now she was something more, a national symbol of what happens when power meets accountability. The final irony was impossible to ignore. The security cameras that recorded Raleigh's assault were courthouse equipment, installed to protect judges and staff from outside threats. Raleigh had activated his own body camera that day, out of habit. The very systems meant to ensure safety became the evidence that ended his career and sent him to prison. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And, speaking of sleep, if you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes, your mood suffers. Everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk, nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 3-0 Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program, no pills, no medication, that actually retrains your brain to sleep through the night. 7 to 8 hours, uninterrupted. Over 30 days, it rewires your sleep system. And once you're done, you keep the results. There's a maintenance plan so you don't slip back. Look, if you've tried everything and nothing sticks, this is different. Check the link in the description. Seriously, try it, and I'll catch you in the next story.
Hey! Don't move! Step away from the car right now!
Officer, this is my home. What's going on?
I asked you a question. You fit the description, and people like you always think you can talk your way out.
I haven't done anything
That's
wrong.
what you all say. Turn around before I make you.
You're making a serious mistake.
At 6:14 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Alexandria, Virginia, inside one of the most exclusive gated communities in the D.C. metro area, a black woman stood alone in her driveway loading luggage into the back of a silver Lexus SUV. Her name was Nadine Ashford. She was 54 years old. She had been a United States federal judge for 11 years, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and assigned to a bench where she had handled hundreds of cases involving constitutional law, civil rights, and federal criminal matters. That morning, she wore no robe and carried no gavel. She was dressed in a casual travel outfit, yoga pants, a zip-up jacket, and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She was heading to Dulles International Airport to catch a 9:15 flight to Chicago for a federal judicial conference where she was scheduled to deliver the keynote address on the future of due process in immigration law. Her carry-on sat on the curb. A garment bag hung from the rear door handle. A travel mug of coffee rested on the roof of the car. Everything about the scene was ordinary, a woman leaving her home on a quiet weekend morning. But what happened in the next 11 minutes would trigger a federal investigation, destroy careers inside one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country, and send shockwaves from a suburban driveway all the way to the halls of Congress. At 6:17 a.m., 3 unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans turned onto Ashford Street and rolled to a stop directly in front of her driveway, blocking her vehicle completely. 6 agents in tactical vests exited in formation. The letters ICE were printed across their chests. The lead agent was Craig Delano, 43 years old, a supervisory detention and deportation officer with 16 years in federal law enforcement. He had a reputation inside his field office for running aggressive operations, for pushing boundaries that other supervisors walked carefully around, and for a pattern of complaints from communities of color that had been quietly filed and never acted upon. He approached Ashford with his hand resting on his sidearm, his posture wide, his jaw set. "You, stop what you're doing. Step away from the vehicle." Ashford turned slowly, both hands visible, one still holding a folded jacket. She looked at the agents, then at Delano. "Can I help you?" Delano didn't answer the question. "You match the description of a person of interest in an active immigration enforcement operation. I need to see identification. Now." Ashford set the jacket on the bumper. Her voice was calm, measured, the tone of someone who had spent over a decade controlling courtrooms. "I'm Judge Nadine Ashford. I'm a federal judge with the United States District Court. This is my home." Delano's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the SUV, then back at her. "Sure you are." He turned his head slightly toward the agent behind him. "She's being evasive. Watch her hands." Ashford didn't flinch. "Do you have a warrant?" "I don't need a warrant. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle." Her voice stayed level but firm. "Yes, you do. You are on private property. You have not identified a crime. You have not presented a warrant. As a matter of law, you do not have authority to detain me." Delano stepped closer, close enough that his vest nearly touched her shoulder. "I don't answer to you. Turn around. Now." Ashford held his gaze. "I'm asking you one more time. Do you have a warrant?" Delano said nothing. His hand moved from his sidearm to her arm. Across the street, a porch light clicked on. A curtain moved in a second-floor window. An older man in a bathrobe stepped outside and stood motionless on his front lawn, phone already raised. Neighbors were watching, and someone had already pressed record. Agent Tara Schofield, 31, second in command on the team, and 7 years into a career she had built by never questioning the lead agent on any operation, moved silently behind Ashford. She positioned herself at the judge's left shoulder, cutting off any path of retreat, her hands already reaching forward. Delano grabbed Ashford's right arm and spun her body toward the SUV. The motion was fast and violent. Ashford's shoulder struck the side mirror with a dull crack that echoed across the quiet street. Her coffee mug slid off the roof and shattered on the driveway. She didn't scream. She didn't swing. She planted her feet and said clearly, loud enough for every agent and every neighbor now stepping outside to hear, "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake." Delano's voice came back hard. "Stop resisting." She was not resisting. Her hands were open. Her body was still. Schofield grabbed her left arm and wrenched it behind her back. Together they forced her forward, pressing her chest against the hood of her own vehicle, the metal still cold from the morning air. Delano snapped the cuffs on, ratcheting them tighter than necessary. Ashford's cheek pressed against the paint. Her glasses fell from her head and landed on the concrete. From across the street, a voice cut through the scene like a blade. "That's Judge Ashford." "What the hell are you doing?" The man crossing the lawn was Colonel Eldon Pratt, 68 years old, retired United States Air Force, 30 years of service, a man who had commanded squadrons overseas, and now lived 3 houses down from a woman he had known for nearly a decade. He moved fast for his age, bathrobe open, slippers on wet grass, finger pointed directly at Delano. Delano turned. "Sir, get back, now, or you will be detained for obstruction of a federal operation." Pratt didn't move. Behind him, through the front window of his home, his wife was already on the phone with 911, her voice shaking as she described what she was watching from her living room. Without a word of explanation, the agents began searching Ashford's vehicle. No consent was given, no warrant was produced, no inventory sheet was started. They opened the rear hatch and pulled out her suitcase, unzipping it on the driveway. They went through her clothes, her toiletry bag, her shoes. They opened her purse and emptied it onto the hood beside her, wallet, keys, lipstick, reading glasses, case, all of it spread out in plain view of the growing crowd. Then they reached the briefcase. It was a leather attaché case with a combination lock, which one of the agents forced open. Inside were sealed federal court documents stamped with case numbers and classification markings, a judicial ID badge from the United States District Court, credentials issued by the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts bearing her photograph, her name, and her title. Delano picked up the judicial ID and held it in front of his face. He stared at it. The photo matched the woman on the hood. The name matched the name she had given. The seal was authentic. Schofield leaned over his shoulder and read the credentials. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but everyone watching felt it. The air shifted. The truth was sitting in Delano's hand, laminated and embossed with the seal of the federal judiciary. But instead of uncuffing her, instead of stepping back and recognizing the magnitude of what he had done, Delano doubled down. He turned to his team. "Finish the sweep. These could be forged." Ashford, still pressed against the hood of her own car in her own driveway, spoke with a voice that carried the weight of 11 years on the federal bench. "You are now searching sealed federal court documents without authorization. You have committed multiple federal crimes." At the back of the formation, the youngest agent on the team, Kyle Rennick, 28, barely a year out of the academy, stood motionless. His face was pale. He leaned towards Schofield and said quietly, "We need to stop." Schofield didn't look at him. Her jaw tightened. "Shut up." By now, 7 neighbors stood on the street and across lawns in various states of Saturday morning dress. Bathrobes, slippers, coffee cups still in hand. 4 of them had phones raised, recording from different angles. The red lights on their screens blinked steadily. Colonel Pratt had not moved from the edge of the driveway. He stood with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking loudly and deliberately to the 911 dispatcher, making sure his voice carried. "I am reporting an unlawful arrest in progress. Federal agents have detained a sitting United States federal judge in her own driveway. No warrant has been presented. She is in handcuffs. I need local police here immediately." A woman appeared from 3 doors down, walking fast across the wet grass. She was Beverly Osei, 46 years old, a tenured professor of constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center, a published scholar on Fourth Amendment protections and federal overreach, and a woman who had known Nadine Ashford for 6 years as a neighbor and a friend. She stepped onto the driveway and spoke directly to Delano. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the precision of someone who had argued before appellate courts. "I know this woman. She is a sitting Article III federal judge appointed under the Constitution of the United States. You are violating 18 U.S.C. 111, which prohibits assault on a federal officer, and 18 U.S.C. 1501, which prohibits obstruction of judicial process. Uncuff her immediately." Delano turned toward her, jaw tight. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back. Leave now, or you will be placed under arrest for interference with a federal operation. Osei did not move. Not one step. She held her phone steady at chest level, the camera pointed directly at Delano's face. I'm a constitutional law professor at Georgetown. I'm not leaving. And neither is my camera. Schofield shifted behind Ashford, glancing at the growing number of recordings, the witnesses, the retired colonel, still narrating into his phone. For the first time, something in her posture changed. Not guilt, not conscience, just the faint awareness that the ground beneath this operation had already given way. Delano stepped away from the driveway and walked toward the lead Suburban. He pulled his phone from his vest pocket and dialed. The neighbor footage captured what followed from a distance, but with perfect clarity. Delano pacing in a tight circle beside the vehicle, his free hand rubbing his forehead, then gripping the back of his neck, his voice rising, though the words were not fully audible. His gestures sharp and agitated. He was calling his field office supervisor. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When he returned to the driveway, his face had changed. The aggression was still there, buried just beneath the surface, but layered now with something else, something closer to damage control. He walked to Ashford, still pressed against the hood, and unlocked the cuffs without a word of explanation. He didn't apologize. Didn't acknowledge the badges, the credentials, the sealed court documents now scattered across the trunk of her car. He stepped back and said flatly, "There's been a mix-up." "You're free to go." Ashford straightened slowly. She rolled her shoulders, wincing as the left one moved. The bruise from the side mirror was already darkening beneath her jacket. She looked down at her wrists. The cuff marks were deep and red, pressed into her skin like brands. Her glasses lay cracked on the concrete. Her suitcase was open on the driveway, clothes spilling out. Her briefcase had been forced open, and sealed federal documents lay fanned across the trunk, exposed to the morning air and every camera still recording. She looked directly at Delano. Her voice was steady, controlled, and unmistakable. This was not a mix-up. This was a choice. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out her own phone, and began recording. She panned slowly across the scene, the cuffs on the ground, the scattered documents, the 6 agents standing in a loose formation, none of them making eye contact, the 3 black SUVs still blocking her driveway, the neighbors on the street. She narrated as she filmed, her voice carrying the practiced clarity of a woman who understood the power of a record. "My name is Judge Nadine Ashford. I am a United States federal judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. Today is Saturday. It is approximately 6:30 a.m. I was detained in handcuffs in my own driveway by agents of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. No warrant was presented. No probable cause existed. I was not told what crime I was suspected of. My vehicle was searched. Sealed federal court documents were handled without authorization. I was arrested in my own driveway because I am black." Within 30 minutes of the SUVs pulling away from her street, the first calls began. They moved fast, and they moved in every direction. Colonel Eldon Pratt stood in his kitchen, still in his bathrobe, and dialed a friend he had served with decades earlier who now held a senior advisory position at the Pentagon. He described what he had watched from his front lawn. His voice was controlled but furious. "They cuffed a federal judge on the hood of her own car. I watched them do it. There was no warrant. There was no reason. She told them who she was and they didn't care." 3 doors down, Beverly Osei sat at her dining table and called the dean of Georgetown University Law Center. She gave a precise, unemotional summary of the legal violations she had witnessed and told the dean she intended to file formal statements with every relevant oversight body before the end of the day. 2 streets over, a neighbor named Franklin Yates forwarded his phone video to his daughter in Maryland, who worked as a junior editor at the Washington Post. She watched it once, then walked it directly to her supervising editor. Judge Ashford sat in her living room with an ice pack on her shoulder and called the chief judge of her circuit. She did not raise her voice. She did not break down. She spoke the way she had spoken on the bench for 11 years, with precision and weight. "I was just arrested by ICE in my driveway. I was cuffed, searched, and humiliated. There was no warrant. The chief judge made one call to the administrative office of the U.S. courts. The administrative office contacted the Department of Justice Inspector General. The DOJ IG contacted the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General. DHS OIG contacted ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility. Each call was shorter than the last. Each one carried more urgency. By 8 a.m., less than 2 hours after Delano had first stepped out of his Suburban, the machinery of federal accountability was in full motion. Back at the ICE field office in Fairfax, Craig Delano sat at a desk in a windowless room and typed his incident report. His version of events bore no resemblance to what had actually happened on that driveway. He wrote that he had encountered an uncooperative individual who refused to identify herself and physically resisted agents during a lawful enforcement action. He wrote that the subject became combative and that the force used was necessary and proportional. He described the detention as routine. He made no mention of the judicial ID, no mention of the sealed court documents, no mention of the 7 witnesses, no mention of the cameras. He filed the report at 9:47 a.m. and flagged it as a standard field encounter with no further action required. Agent Tara Schofield read the report, added her electronic signature without a word of objection, and returned to her desk. Then Delano walked the document to Kyle Rennick. The youngest agent on the team sat in a chair near the back of the office, his jacket still on, his hands clasped between his knees. He had not spoken since they returned from the operation. Delano placed the report in front of him and pointed to the signature line. Rennick read it. His eyes moved across the words, then stopped. He looked up. That's not what happened. Delano leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that the words stayed between them. Sign it, or your career is over. Rennick looked at the report. He looked at Delano, and he signed. But that night, alone in his apartment, Kyle Rennick sat on the edge of his bed and dialed the DHS Office of Inspector General anonymous hotline. His voice was quiet but steady. He identified himself by badge number. He said the incident report filed that morning by Supervisory Officer Craig Delano was fabricated. He said every material claim in it was false. He said the subject had been compliant, had identified herself clearly, had been a federal judge, and had been cuffed, searched, and humiliated without a warrant or probable cause. He said he would cooperate fully with any investigation, and then he asked for one thing: whistleblower protection. Because the man who had told him to sign that report was the same man who had put a federal judge in handcuffs that morning, and Rennick had seen exactly how far Delano was willing to go. Monday morning at 8 a.m., the DHS Inspector General formally opened an investigation into the detention of federal judge Nadine Ashford. By 8:30, the DOJ Civil Rights Division had assigned a team of attorneys to the case. By 9:15, the FBI was looped in, and the reason was simple. Federal judicial officers are protected under federal law. Assaulting or interfering with a sitting federal judge is a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. 111. Threatening or retaliating against a federal judge is a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. 115. This was not an internal affairs matter. This was not a policy review. This was a criminal investigation. FBI agents arrived at the ICE field office in Fairfax before lunch. They came with subpoenas and forensic technicians. They seized Bodycam footage from every agent on the team. They pulled GPS data from all 3 Suburbans. They copied radio communications from the morning of the incident. And they took Delano's operational planning documents, the targeting files, the address lists, the authorization memos, every piece of paper that was supposed to justify what happened on that driveway. What they found in those documents changed the shape of the entire investigation. There was no warrant for Nadine Ashford. There was no warrant for her address. There was no warrant for anyone at that address. There was no warrant for anyone on her street. The enforcement operation that morning had been targeting an individual in a neighboring zip code more than 2 miles away, in a different subdivision, on a street with a different name. Ashford's home was never part of any authorized federal action. Craig Delano had gone to the wrong street. And rather than verify, rather than pause, rather than check the address against his own operational file, he had looked at a black woman standing in a driveway and decided she was the target. FBI Digital Forensics spent the next 48 hours recovering and cataloging body cam footage from 3 agents on Delano's team, including Delano's own camera and Schofield's. The footage was time-stamped, geotagged, and continuous. It showed everything. It showed Ashford turning slowly with her hands visible. It showed her calm voice identifying herself as a federal judge. It showed Delano scoffing. It showed him grabbing her arm and spinning her into the side mirror of her own vehicle. It showed Schofield wrenching her other arm behind her back. It showed them pressing her face against the hood and cuffing her while she repeated, clearly and without hysteria, "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake." It showed Ashford's body going still, fully compliant, not a single movement that could be characterized as resistance by any use of force expert in the country. It showed the agents tearing through her vehicle without consent, without a warrant, without documentation. It showed Delano holding her judicial ID badge in his hand, reading it, pausing, and then ordering his team to finish the sweep. It showed the sealed federal court documents being pulled from her briefcase and spread across the trunk, and it showed one moment that would become the most replayed clip in the entire investigation. Kyle Rennick leaning towards Schofield and whispering, "We need to stop," and Schofield, without turning her head, whispering back, "Shut up." Every frame of the footage directly contradicted every line of the incident report Delano had filed. Every claim of resistance was a lie. Every claim of combative behavior was fabricated. Every justification for force was invented. The neighbor videos, 4 separate angles recorded from phones across the street, corroborated the body cam footage frame by frame, word by word, second by second. A senior FBI analyst assigned to the case reviewed the combined footage, all 7 recordings synced to a single timeline, and wrote a single line in the official case file that would follow Craig Delano for the rest of his life. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of unlawful arrest, excessive force, and false reporting I have reviewed in 22 years of federal law enforcement. ICE leadership moved fast, but not fast enough. By Monday afternoon, Craig Delano and Tara Schofield were placed on immediate unpaid suspension. Their badges were confiscated. Their credentials were deactivated. Their access to federal systems was revoked. The field office director in Fairfax, a two-year veteran named Leonard Stokes, was quietly reassigned to an administrative role at a regional processing center, removed from command without public explanation. A joint statement was drafted between ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. It went through 4 revisions. Legal teams on both sides argued over language. They wanted to express concern without admitting liability, to acknowledge the incident without conceding wrongdoing. They planned to release it Wednesday morning with carefully controlled timing. But the internet did not wait for their schedule. Tuesday evening, one of the neighbor videos was uploaded to social media by the daughter of Franklin Yates, the neighbor who had recorded from across the street. It was 2 minutes and 47 seconds long. It showed the cuffing, the search, the scattered documents, and Judge Ashford's voice, clear as a courtroom ruling, saying, "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake." Within 12 hours, it had been viewed 4 million times. The headline was everywhere, on every network, every news site, every front page. ICE agents cuff black federal judge in her own driveway. No warrant. By Wednesday morning, 3 members of the Senate Judiciary Committee had publicly demanded hearings. The full committee opened a formal inquiry by Thursday. The Congressional Black Caucus held a press conference on the steps of the Capitol, calling the incident a grotesque abuse of federal power rooted in racial profiling. The Chief Justice of the United States was briefed in a private meeting with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. And then something happened that had not happened in over a decade. The federal judiciary, an institution that almost never speaks publicly on matters outside the courtroom, released a formal statement. It was 3 sentences long. It called the arrest of Judge Ashford an attack on the independence of the federal judiciary and a violation of the constitutional separation of powers. It said the judiciary expected full accountability from every agency and individual involved, and it said the courts would be watching. Those three sentences landed like a hammer inside every federal law enforcement agency in the country. 8 weeks later, a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia returned its indictments. The charges against Craig Delano were devastating in their scope. Deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. 242, for detaining, cuffing, and searching a United States federal judge without a warrant, without probable cause, and without legal authority of any kind. Assault on a federal officer under 18 U.S.C. 111 for the physical force used against a sitting Article III judge, the grab, the spin into the side mirror, the compression against the hood, the cuffing, falsifying federal records under 18 U.S.C. 1001 for filing an incident report that was fabricated from the first word to the last, claiming resistance that never occurred, claiming combative behavior that every camera on the scene disproved, and conspiracy to obstruct justice under 18 U.S.C. 1512 for pressuring a subordinate agent to co-sign a false report and for attempting to construct a fraudulent official record designed to conceal the truth of what had happened on that driveway. Tara Schofield was charged with conspiracy, deprivation of rights under color of law, and falsifying federal records. The grand jury found that she had participated in the unlawful detention, had used physical force against a compliant subject, had co-signed a report she knew to be false, and had actively silenced a fellow agent who attempted to intervene. Kyle Rennick, the 28-year-old agent who had whispered, "We need to stop," and who had called the OIG hotline that same night, was granted full immunity as a cooperating witness. He appeared before the grand jury and testified for nearly 3 hours. He described the operation, the stop, the cuffing, the search, the moment Delano held the judicial ID and chose to continue. He described the pressure to sign the false report. He described Delano's words exactly: "Sign it or your career is over." 2 additional agents from the team were named as unindicted co-conspirators for their participation in the warrantless search of Ashford's vehicle and their failure to intervene during the use of force. And the field office supervisor who had taken Delano's phone call from the driveway that morning, the call where Delano had paced and rubbed his forehead while a federal judge stood in cuffs behind him, was placed under a separate investigation for failure to act, because the question investigators wanted answered was simple: what did Delano tell him on that call? And why did it take a phone call to a supervisor for anyone on that team to uncuff a woman who had already identified herself, shown her credentials, and told them exactly who she was? The trial began on a Monday morning in the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, the same courthouse where Judge Nadine Ashford had presided over cases for more than a decade. She was not on the bench this time. She was seated in the gallery, watching the system she had spent her career serving attempt to hold accountable the men and women who had violated it. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution opened with the footage. They played the Bodycam recordings from Delano's camera, from Schofield's camera, and from a third agent whose chest-mounted unit had captured a wide angle of the entire driveway. They played all 4 neighbor videos, synced to a single timeline, projected onto a screen large enough for every juror to see every detail. The courtroom was silent. 12 jurors watched a federal judge in yoga pants get spun into a side mirror, pressed against the hood of her own car, and cuffed in her own driveway, while calmly identifying herself over and over again. They watched agents tear through her luggage. They watched sealed federal court documents get spread across a trunk. They watched Delano hold her judicial ID in his hand and order his team to keep going. Kyle Rennick took the stand on the 4th day. He described the operation from the inside. He described the moment he realized there was no warrant. He described the look on Ashford's face when the cuffs went on. He described whispering to Schofield that they needed to stop, and her response, "Shut up!" And he described sitting in the field office afterward, reading the incident report Delano had written, knowing every word of it was a lie, and hearing Delano lean in and say, "Sign it or your career is over." His voice broke once during testimony. He paused, took a breath, and continued. Beverly Osei testified as both a legal expert and an eyewitness. She walked the jury through the constitutional violations in clinical detail, then described what she had seen from her neighbor's lawn in language that was anything but clinical. She described a woman she had known for years, a woman who had dedicated her life to the law, being treated like a suspect in her own driveway by men who did not care what she said or who she was. Colonel Eldon Pratt, 68, retired Air Force, took the stand in a press suit and spoke in the clipped, precise cadence of a man who had spent 3 decades in military service. He described crossing his street in slippers and a bathrobe. He described shouting at federal agents. He described the moment Delano threatened to detain him for obstruction. And he described the look in Judge Ashford's eyes when her face was pressed against the hood of her car. "I have seen men and women in combat zones," he said. "I have never seen someone maintain that kind of composure under that kind of humiliation." Then Judge Ashford herself took the stand. The courtroom went still. She described the morning in detail. The coffee on the roof of her car, the garment bag, the sound of the SUVs, the moment Delano grabbed her arm, the impact of her shoulder against the side mirror, the cold metal of the hood, the tightness of the cuffs, the sound of her glasses hitting the concrete. She described the fear, the kind she had never experienced on the bench, the kind that lived in the body, not the mind. She described the humiliation of having her clothes pulled from her suitcase and spread across her own driveway. She described watching a man hold her judicial ID in his hand, read it, and decide it didn't matter. And then she said the words that would be quoted in every newspaper, every legal journal, and every civil rights filing for years to come. "I have spent my career upholding the Constitution. That morning, I learned how it feels when the Constitution fails to protect you." Delano's defense team argued good faith, wrong address, high-pressure environment, a rapidly evolving situation. They said their client had made an honest mistake under difficult operational conditions and that the force used was consistent with standard enforcement protocols. The prosecution dismantled the argument in a single afternoon. "If this was a mistake," the lead prosecutor said, standing directly in front of the jury, "then why did he write a report claiming she resisted? Why did he claim she was combative? Why did he pressure a junior agent to sign a document he knew was false? A mistake is going to the wrong address. A crime is what you do after you realize you went to the wrong address and decide to lie about it." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned on a Friday afternoon. Craig Delano, guilty on all counts, deprivation of rights, assault on a federal judge, falsifying federal records. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, Tara Schofield, guilty on conspiracy and falsifying federal records. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Delano stared straight ahead. Schofield closed her eyes. In the gallery, Judge Ashford sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later in the same courtroom. Craig Delano stood before the bench in a Navy suit, no badge, no tactical vest, no sidearm. The man who had once told a federal judge, "I don't answer to you," now stood with his hands clasped in front of him, answering to a federal court. The sentencing judge, a veteran of the bench with more than 2 decades of experience, did not mince words. He looked directly at Delano as he spoke. "You did not merely make a mistake. You targeted, brutalized, and then lied about a sitting federal judge of the United States. You searched her vehicle without a warrant. You handled sealed court documents without authorization. You filed a federal report that was fabricated from beginning to end. And when a junior agent on your own team tried to tell the truth, you threatened to destroy his career unless he helped you bury it. You did not act in good faith. You acted with arrogance, with impunity, and with a belief that your badge placed you above the very laws you swore to enforce. The courts will not tolerate this." Craig Delano was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Tara Schofield stood next. She received 3 years. The judge noted that while her conduct was less aggressive than Delano's, her willingness to co-sign a false report, her active silencing of a fellow agent, and her failure to intervene during an unlawful arrest made her equally culpable in the conspiracy to cover up what had happened. Neither defendant spoke during sentencing, neither apologized, neither looked at Judge Ashford, who sat in the same seat she had occupied during the trial, watching the system deliver what the driveway had not. Within weeks of the verdict, Judge Ashford filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Craig Delano, Tara Schofield, the Fairfax Field Office, and the supervisory chain that had enabled the operation. The lawsuit cited unlawful arrest, excessive force, racial profiling, violations of the Fourth Amendment, and interference with a federal judicial officer. Discovery revealed internal communications, operational failures, and a pattern of complaints against Delano's unit that had been documented but never acted upon. The government's attorneys reviewed the evidence, the footage, the verdict, the public record, and recommended settlement. The case was resolved before trial for $4.6 million, one of the largest individual settlements in a federal civil rights case involving law enforcement. But the money was not the headline. The terms were. As part of the settlement, mandatory reforms were imposed on the Fairfax Field Office and adopted as a model across the agency. Independent civilian oversight of all enforcement operations involving residential addresses, revised protocols requiring warrant verification at every stage before agents made contact with any subject, anti-bias training administered quarterly with external review, a prohibition on conducting enforcement actions at any address not explicitly listed in the operational authorization, and a requirement that all incident reports be independently reviewed within 48 hours by personnel outside the reporting chain. The reforms did not undo what had happened on that driveway, but they made it harder for it to happen again. Craig Delano reported to a federal correctional facility in Cumberland, Maryland, with nothing but a single bag of approved personal items. His 6-year career was over. His federal pension was forfeited. His name now lived permanently in the Federal Bureau of Prisons inmate database. Tara Schofield was barred from federal employment for life. Her security clearance was revoked. She had spent 7 years building a career by never questioning the person above her. That silence cost her everything. Leonard Stokes, the field office director, retired under pressure without ceremony. 2 supervisors were formally demoted for failing to act on prior complaints against Delano's unit. Kyle Rennick was transferred to a new field office and 6 months later received a formal commendation from the DHS Inspector General for demonstrating integrity under extraordinary pressure. He never spoke publicly about the case. He didn't need to. Judge Nadine Ashford returned to the bench. She declined interviews and book deals, but at a judicial conference 6 months later, she stood at the podium and spoke without notes. The law failed me that morning. But the people did not. My neighbors came outside. A retired colonel crossed the street in his bathrobe. A law professor stood on my driveway and refused to move. A young agent with everything to lose made a phone call that changed the course of this case. She established the Ashford Justice Initiative, funding legal defense for victims of unlawful federal enforcement actions. A training module based on the incident was adopted by DHS, the DOJ, and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. It included the full Bodycam footage, the false report, and Rennick's testimony. On the final slide was a photograph of her driveway, the handcuffs on the concrete, the scattered judicial documents, 3 unmarked Suburbans blocking the path of a woman who had done nothing but exist in her own home. Beneath it, in plain black letters, "This is what happens when power operates without accountability." Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, if you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes. Your mood suffers. Everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk, nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 3-0 Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program